As Russia continues its assault on Ukraine, Moscow is increasingly using harsh tactics to control information about the war. This includes banning Facebook and passing a law that could jail journalists and others for promoting what it calls fake news about its military. Chris Krebs is here to discuss. He is the former director of the U.S. Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency and partner at the Krebs Stamos Group. Thank you so much for joining us. So, I find this very, very interesting because there's always a question as to what Russians, how they understand what's going on. Of course, we love to cover all the protests that are happening, but as I understand it, most Russians believe the state narrative. How is Russia working to control the narrative about this war? How are they weaponizing, information and social media?
Well, it's actually not clear at this point, I think, what the population believes from any sort of, percentages or proportionate, whether they actually believe the state narrative or whether they are questioning the judgment and in the war itself. And part of that is due to some of the information restrictions that you've put out, that you just referenced, including Facebook and even TikTok today mentioned that they are suspending live streaming and some original content. So it's not clear exactly what's going on in Russia, but we have seen protests. There have been a number of arrests, but conversely, there have also been some of these online and viral videos about these very bizarre proto-fascist videos of supporters of the letter Z, which is, of course, the letter, one of the symbols that's been used in Ukraine. But ultimately, what's happened here, in my view, is that Putin has lost control of the narrative, and that there is anti-Russia, anti-Putin, anti-invasion, anti-war information that's coming into the Russian information space, and that is a direct threat to the authority of Vladimir Putin from the Kremlin.
So, Chris, it's such a fascinating discussion. And in fact, Anne-Marie and I were talking about it during the commercial break. Obviously, you just mentioned it, that it does appear that Russia is losing the information war, which would suggest that Ukraine is winning the information war. But let's be clear and objective about this. Ukraine also is out there with propaganda, with a message that, for example, we keep hearing the steady drumbeat of no-fly zones. You hear it from, moms in bomb shelters, and you hear it from parliament members in Ukraine. That is a bit of an information war as well. It gets on the lips of U.S. politicians here, journalists. And so I'm curious about the dynamic at play here between Russia losing the information war and Ukraine winning one. How do you see it?
Well, I'd suggest that Russia has in fact lost the information war, and it's not recoverable at this point. The narratives are so much more compelling on the Ukraine side. And in part, the stage was set for this years ago. The Russians have been engaged in this sort of anti-democratic behavior, at some point interfering or intervening in 30 different national elections over the last several years. And so there's been a certain degree of inoculation of the public where you would expect Russia to do something along these lines, and therefore some skepticism has been built into every one of us. And so it was easy when the intelligence community made the decision to declassify information about some of the sabotage campaigns and the false flags. It fit the narrative that Russia would try to do those sorts of things. And so the pre-bunking and the active debunking of individual actions of the Russians, in addition to the fact that they continue to recycle old tropes of the past, the biolabs that were being built in Ukraine, for instance. That's the same theme that the Russians used in Georgia in 2008 and around that time period. So, there's really nothing new under the sun in terms of Russian information operations. To your point, though, the Ukrainians have a more compelling narrative. The Ghost of Kiev is a great example of the ace, the heroes of Snake Island. Over time, these things may come true, or rather maybe, uncovered as not true. But in the moment, they are the more compelling narratives and have whipped support to the side of Ukraine.
Well, Chris, that's the information war with the rest of the world. But what about within Russia, where Vladimir Putin can control the narrative? He controls a state-run TV. And quite frankly, as long as he maintains the support of Russian people, who knows how long this could go on for? I mean, is he winning that war?
And can I just add to that, to Anne-Marie's question, Chris? If you imagine that there are still some people here in this country who refuse to acknowledge that President Biden won the presidential election, and we have a free and open press. So imagine if you are a Russian citizen where Vladimir Putin has destroyed all vestiges of any free and open press, what most Russian people might believe about what is happening across the border.
Well, let's separate those two things out, because the first piece you mentioned about some of the Stop the Stealers, there is an increasing overlap of some of the more strident Stop the Stealers and those that believe in the Putin narrative, and that they're in there, that they have moved into Ukraine to denazify, to eradicate pedophiles, and that there's some massive human trafficking operation. That and that narrative, I fear, will only grow as this conflict continues. There will be lots of space and opportunity for some of these more far-flung and far-fetched narratives to take root here domestically. As for in Russia, yes, the information narrative can be tightly controlled, state media, no independent journalism, no foreign inputs. But the reality, the economic reality of the war on Russia will have an effect, not just on the everyday people on, the Russian Main Street equivalent, but in the supporting cadre and oligarchs around Putin. When the screws get tightened on them and they don't have the ability to travel internationally, when they cannot access their funds in Swiss banks and otherwise, when they can't, when their yachts are getting snapped up. But back to the Main Street point, all these companies, these American and Western companies that are pulling out of the Russian market, because in part a social responsibility statement, as well as not wanting to support an active war effort, that will accrue. The economic impact in Russia will be devastating. There are projections of an oncoming depression in Russia. That will have an effect, and Putin will steadily lose support at home.
Chris, what you've been talking about is the Russian narrative as to why Vladimir Putin is justifying going into Ukraine. But one of the things that Russians are really, really good at is identifying divisions that may not be sort of directly on topic and exacerbating them. And you talk about that with the overlap, with the Stop the Steal people. And I wonder if we're seeing any of that with the misinformation, not directly. I guess misinformation that doesn't appear as if it's coming directly from Russia, but it may very well be.
Well, but to Anne-Marie's question, Chris, let me just add to that. I'm curious if you've seen a de-escalation of Russian troll bot activity, which is part of, for example, this peace or freedom convoy that was moving towards Washington, D.C. 2 to 3 weeks ago, before all these sanctions went into place. There was enormous activity on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook. Since these sanctions have gone into place, I wonder if you're hearing from people in the cyberspace world that activity has diminished, specifically because of some of these sanctions that have been put into place, so that the activity may not be in Russia, but by perhaps people who are funneling assets from Russia to those bot farms.
This is a great observation, and one of those that has been discussed in the information security as well as the disinformation spaces. And it's not clear that there's been any sort of technical impact by sanctions and limitation of information. And one of the theories that I've seen that I actually tend to believe in is from Renee DeResta, who's a professor with Stanford and the Internet Observatory. She suggested that it's more a function of the attention economy, that it's the folks that were previously supporting the convoy have now shifted their focus over to some aspect of the Russia-Ukraine invasion. and so I think volumetrically it's probably consistent, but it's where the target of that sort of activity is. But to the bigger point, look, My view here is not that they're tactically sophisticated in identifying those divisions, the Russians that is, identifying the divisions and focusing their efforts. What they're doing is they're flooding the zone. There's no single narrative that they see as really particularly compelling or that they're placing all their bets on. They're flooding the zone to undermine confidence, to sow this confusion and have us all kind of look around and say, what is going on here? And the defenders cannot debunk every single claim. The truth takes too much time to develop and lay out that argument. So that is why it is so important that the intelligence community and Ukrainians have been aggressive in their own right to establish their narrative, so everything else is just simply noise. And the more rational, I think, consumers of information can sort through the signal from the noise.
Just a fascinating discussion.
It really is.
Chris Krebs, the former director of U.S. Cybersecurity Infrastructure. Thank you, as always, my friend. Really, really great stuff. Appreciate it.